The audience is so fragmented now, and there's such a battle for ratings, and with so many cable outlets, it's hard to imagine that they're not somehow affected by the money they need to bring in. It's, I think, high time that we had a source for news, like the Real News Network, where you can just count on it not being influenced, because there's no way that it can be.
Last week, the President of the United Nations General Assembly used the word apartheid when talking about Israel and the Palestinians. What is the significance of this? Well, now joining us is Phyllis Bennis from the Institute of Policy Studies, and she's in Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us, Phyllis. So, Phyllis, what's the significance of this statement?
It was an extraordinary moment. There were actually two statements by the General Assembly President, Miguel de Soto, Father Miguel de Soto, the former foreign minister of Nicaragua during the 1980s Sandinista years. What he said was that the United Nations should not be afraid to call it what it is, which is apartheid. And he referred back specifically to the role that civil society had played in the era of the anti-apartheid movement around South Africa. And he said, the United Nations had learned from civil society and had taken the lead from civil society in recognizing the need for sanctions and divestment against South Africa. And isn't it time, he said, for us in the United Nations to go back to that and say we should consider sanctions against Israel to ensure its implementation of international law and to stop its violations. It wasn't the first time those words had ever been used, but for it to come from the highest levels of the most democratic part of the United Nations, the General Assembly, was really quite extraordinary.
Now, just to be fair, he is from the Nicaraguan government, which is now controlled by the Sandinistas.
But he doesn't. No, he doesn't represent the Nicaraguan government. He served in the Nicaraguan government in the 1980s. He's been independent since then. The President of the General Assembly is a very odd position in the UN. It's not representing a country. Whoever is the president, you serve for 1 year, and that person is elected as an individual, not representing their country, which is important because it means they're not representing the policies of their own government. They are free to say and do what their own priorities are.
Well, how were his comments received amongst the General Council?
In the General Assembly, it was received with extraordinary enthusiasm. There was a great deal of excitement that somebody in an official position, there was also, of course, a civil society representative, Eddie McHugh, the head of the South African Council of Churches, spoke that day and used very much the same language. And that's been traditional at the UN every year in the annual meeting about Palestine. But in this case, it was coming not from civil society, but from the United Nations itself, from the president of the General Assembly, who was unanimously elected by the Assembly. So this is a very important development. It also reflected how the discourse has changed around this issue, not only because of Jimmy Carter's incredibly important book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, not only because the Walt Mearsheimer book that broke the taboo of writing about the Israeli lobby, the work of the U.S. campaign to end Israeli occupation, the work of a number of Jewish anti-occupation organizations, and globally, the rise of a global movement against Israeli apartheid that's saying we should call it what it is, and we should develop a strategy, a nonviolent pressure strategy using economic pressure, boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, to force Israeli compliance with international law. These statements by Miguel de Soto at the General Assembly were very much a reflection of how that shift in the discourse has already happened. And it's
now, what does Barack appointment of Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State and his general framing of his vision of foreign policy, what are we to expect from Obama administration vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine?
Well, I think that we will not see much motion initially. We're going into a period, of course, where there's complete political paralysis inside Israel. They're expecting elections in February of next year. And what comes out of that is very uncertain. It's right now neck and neck between the main supporter of the current so-called peace process, which has not gone anywhere since the Annapolis process of a year ago. That would be Tzipi Livni. And she's neck and neck with Bibi Netanyahu from the Likud party, who basically has said he would end all peace talks now with the Palestinians. There's one way in which that might not be as bad as it sounds, because although it would reflect a very dangerous shift even further to the right of Israeli politics, it would recognize that the existing process is a false one. It's not changing, except for the situation on the ground getting worse. It's not moving towards a real, serious solution to the Palestinian Israeli conflict, to the Israeli occupation of Palestine.
So if Obama were to call Phyllis Bennis and say, okay, then what should we do here? What would be your answer?
What we should do, number one, has to do with the U.S. relationship with Israel, which is to say that the $3+ billion a year that the U.S. gives in unconditional military aid to Israel is going to be stopped as long as Israeli settlements continue. That means all the settlements, not only these so-called outposts that are officially acknowledged as illegal under Israeli law, which, by the way, have not been eliminated anyway. All of the settlements are illegal under international law. They should all be ended and dismantled. Until that happens, the U.S. should not provide Israel with military aid. Period. Full stop. That should be President-elect Obama's first step.
We're highly unlikely to see that.
Highly unlikely. We see Hillary Clinton, who's known as an uncritical, fierce defender of U.S. backing for all Israeli policies, including the settlement policy. So I don't anticipate that we're going to see significant motion.
Now, there's the proposal that came from the Saudis about returning to 67 borders and building a peace agreement around that with East Jerusalem as a capital of Palestine. And within that framework, that seems to be what Obama is going to try to push for. As you say, if Likud is elected, it's going to be difficult. But why isn't that a basis of a peace plan?
It could be the basis of discussions. There's some serious failures in the Arab peace plan, which is, number one, when it talks about borders, it talks about the settlements. It says that it should be the 67 borders with minor adjustments. It says minor, but it says that must be mutually agreed. So its definition of what those border adjustments will mean. Now, up until this day, the Israeli position has been that border adjustments mean full annexation of all the major settlement blocks, leaving behind...
Which are continuing to grow as we speak.
Which are continuing to grow and which include 80% of the settler population, which is about 450,000, 500,000 Israeli settlers, live in occupied East Jerusalem and the occupied West Bank. 80% of those would remain under the Israeli definition, which largely follows the route of the apartheid wall, the separation wall, throughout the West Bank. That land grab also puts all the major water sources, the aquifers, on the Israeli side of the wall. And Tzipi Livni, who I'm sure Barack Obama is hoping wins the election, because she would be a partner in this negotiation, has said that the wall would be the basis of a border between Israel and a Palestinian state. That would leave 80% of the settlers having stolen some of the most fertile land and all the major water resources. It also leaves out the question of the right of return. It essentially says that there would be no right of return except for what Israel might agree to on an individual basis.
Except they're now talking about some form of compensation in exchange for right of return.
Yes, and right. It could be the beginning of discussion. The problem is so often in these situations, because of the vast power disparity between Israel and the Palestinians, what you have is not the beginning of negotiations, but the end game imposed from above. That's the danger here.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, Phyllis. And as we move further into a real Obama administration, we'll see what their Middle East policy actually is. Thanks for joining us. And once again, remember, we depend on you to donate, and I'm pointing at a donate button. It's either up here or down there, but one way or the other, we need your support to keep doing what we're doing. Thank you. Endless wars, abuse of powers, declining living standards, and the climate change crisis. The stakes couldn't be greater in the U.S., and with your help, we're moving our news operation to Washington, D.C., will focus on money and corruption. For example, big oil and arms companies shape American economic and foreign policy with far-reaching effects on the lives of ordinary people. With allies in government, trade unions, the media, and in think tanks, they're a hidden hand that controls the commanding heights of American politics. Taking on the industrial military complex is what real change requires. Even former presidents and high administration officials have said so. But corporate television news treats such positions as marginal. Uncompromising journalism requires questioning assumption, interrogating structures of wealth and power. Corporate TV news just won't do it. Only a news organization that's truly independent can tackle such issues with courage and tenacity. And we'll take on corporate TV news live. You'll watch TV news with our panel of writers, journalists, scientists, and historians. You'll be able to join in by phone, webcam, chat. Together, we'll discuss and debate what's the real story and take on the myth and the propaganda. But this is only possible if you support us now. We need to prove that a viewer-funded model works. So if you want the real news, we need you now. Please click on the donate button and give generously. Now's the time to decide if you want the real news to thrive.
Your tax-deductible donation makes it possible. Please contribute at therealnews.com.